They say you should pick your battles wisely, but sometimes the battle picks you. Paul never wanted trouble. He just wanted to live in peace, enjoy his home, and spend time with his daughter. But when his Tesla was found vandalized, long, deep scratches covering the hood, he realized someone had declared war on him. And when he checked his security cameras and saw the culprit, he almost couldn't believe it. It was Karen Cypher, the ruthless HOA president of Brookwood Estates. But what she didn't know, Paul wasn't just any homeowner. He was a multi-millionaire who had just sold his tech company, and he was about to teach her the most expensive lesson of her life. As he watched her being escorted out of her house in handcuffs, he couldn't help but wonder, did she ever realize she picked a fight with the wrong man? If you've ever battled an overreaching HOA, buckle up, because this story is about to take you on a wild ride. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't believe how this one ends. Paul had always been the kind of guy who minded his own business. His house was his sanctuary, a quiet retreat after long hours spent building his cybersecurity empire. He had chosen Brookwood Estates for its peaceful atmosphere, a place where he could finally breathe after years of grinding. But what he didn't know was that beneath the manicured lawns and pastel-painted fences lurked a dictator in disguise, masquerading as a neighborhood leader, Karen Cypher. It started with something innocent, a simple bumper sticker. Save the bees! A small, unassuming gift from his daughter Emily, who had a passion for nature and spent hours reading about environmental conservation. To Paul, it was a sweet reminder of her and the values he wanted to instill in her. But to Karen, it was an act of rebellion, a violation of her precious HOA rules. The first violation notice arrived the next morning. Paul found it taped neatly to his front door, printed on expensive, glossy HOA letterhead. His initial reaction was confusion. A fine for a bumper sticker? He actually chuckled, shaking his head as he read the ridiculous claim that it disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the community. Then came the second notice, and the third. They appeared like clockwork, each more aggressive than the last. The fines began to stack up like an unwinnable poker game, each one adding pressure, trying to break him. It stopped being funny. Paul felt the burn of frustration creeping up his spine. He was a grown man, a homeowner. Why was he being treated like a misbehaving child? And then one morning, everything changed. Paul stepped outside with his coffee in hand, ready to start another day. But something felt off. A stillness in the air, a sense of wrongness that made his gut tighten. Then he saw it. His Tesla, his pride and joy, was ruined. Long, jagged scratches carved across the hood like claw marks, stretching from headlight to windshield. The paint was ruined, the damage unmistakable. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the pavement. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen. His mind struggled to process the violation, the sheer audacity of it. A sick feeling settled in his stomach, his breath coming in short bursts as rage bubbled up inside him like a volcano ready to erupt. Who would do something like this? And then, as if answering his unspoken question, he remembered the security cameras. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and opened the footage. He fast-forwarded through the night's recording, his pulse hammering against his ribs. And then, there she was, Karen Cypher, dressed in her signature pastel cardigan, moving with practiced arrogance. She strolled up to his car, keys in hand, and without hesitation, dragged them across the hood. Paul could see her lips moving, muttering something under her breath, her smirk widening with each scratch she left behind. His jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He rewound the footage, watching it again, needing to confirm what he was seeing. But there was no mistake. Karen had done this. She had taken her petty vendetta to a whole new level. A storm of emotions crashed over him, anger, disbelief, the deep sting of betrayal. He had spent years building his company, working hard to afford this home, this car. And now some self-important HOA dictator thought she could waltz onto his property and destroy what was his. Paul took a deep, steadying breath. He could have stormed over to her house, pounded on her door, demanded an explanation, but that would be too easy. No, this required something bigger, something calculated. If Karen Cypher wanted a war, she had just declared it. And Paul? He was about to show her that she picked the wrong man to mess with. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to dismantle her entire empire, piece by piece. Paul's first call was to his old college friend Tom, a real estate lawyer who had seen every trick in the book. Paul's hands tightened around his coffee cup, the heat grounding him as he absorbed Tom's words. This wasn't just about a few fines or an overzealous HOA president. This was a full-blown racket, a system designed to squeeze every last cent out of homeowners until they had no choice but to leave. "She's got her hands in everything," Tom said, his voice low but urgent, as if Karen herself might be listening from the next table. He slid a thick manila folder across the polished surface, his fingers drumming anxiously. "Property sales, refinancing, even local businesses. Every time someone moves out, she profits." Paul let out a slow breath, flipping open the folder. The pages inside were filled with contracts, financial reports, and memos, each one another nail in Karen's coffin. He scanned through them, his heart pounding harder with each passing second. This is insane. He ran a hand through his hair, disbelief thick in his tone. "You're telling me she's been orchestrating foreclosures, forcing people out just so she can make a quick buck?" Tom nodded grimly. "It's not just a theory, Paul. It's a pattern. She finds them relentlessly, makes their lives hell, and when they can't pay up, she swoops in and buys their homes at a fraction of their worth. Then she flips them for a profit." Paul clenched his jaw, the taste of bitterness rising in his throat. He had dealt with plenty of corrupt people in his time, business rivals who would sell their own mothers for a better quarter. But this was personal. This was home. "I should have seen it sooner," Paul muttered, shaking his head. "The way people just disappeared. The way homes got repainted, refurnished, resold overnight. I just assumed people were moving on." Tom sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "That's what she wants people to think. No one questions it because it happens so smoothly. The board is in her pocket. The fines are just another tool in her arsenal." Paul's fingers curled into a fist on the table, knuckles turning white. He thought of Mrs. Donnelly, the sweet old woman who had lived down the street. She used to bake cookies for Emily, always waving at him from her perfectly tended garden. One day she was just gone. No explanation, just a for sale sign where her roses used to be. "She got Donnelly, didn't she?" Paul's voice was barely above a whisper, but the anger behind it was unmistakable. Tom hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "She fought back at first, took it to court, but Karen bled her dry. Every motion, every delay, every fine, it all added up. When she couldn't keep up with the legal fees, she was forced to sell." Paul inhaled sharply, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had spoken to Mrs. Donnelly just months ago. She had seemed worried, but she had still been hopeful. He had promised her that everything would be fine. He had lied. Tom must have sensed the shift in Paul's demeanor because he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I know you. You're thinking about going after her, but this isn't like the corporate world. You can't just outbid her on a merger. She plays dirty, Paul." Paul smirked, but there was no humor in it, only ice-cold determination. "So do I," Tom sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Okay, fine. Say you go through with this. What's your plan?" Paul leaned back, folding his arms. "Simple. I buy out the entire damn neighborhood." Tom's eyes widened, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his lips. "You're not seriously thinking—" "I am." Paul's voice was firm, unwavering. "If she profits off people moving out, then let's see how she handles someone who can't be pushed." Tom exhaled, shaking his head. "That's going to cost you." Paul's smirk widened. "Good thing I just sold a company for $50 million. For the first time since they sat down, Tom actually laughed. "Jesus, Paul, you really don't do anything small, do you?" Paul's expression darkened. "Not when it comes to family. Not when it comes to home." Tom studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right. If you're really going to do this, you need a strategy. She has the board, the lawyers, the money." Paul cut him off. "She doesn't have me, not yet." Tom let out a low whistle. "All right then, let's burn this empire to the ground." Within 2 weeks, Paul had quietly executed one of the most cunning moves in Brookwood Estates history. He had purchased 6 properties, each acquisition carefully orchestrated, each deal masked under different shell companies to avoid suspicion. Karen Cypher, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had no idea that her grip on the neighborhood was about to be shattered. The first property was a distressed sale. An elderly couple, tired of Karen's relentless fines, had been looking to move to Florida. Paul, under the alias of Evergreen Holdings LLC, made them a cash offer above market value. They accepted within 48 hours. The second house belonged to a single mother who had been drowning in HOA fines for small infractions, an unapproved flower bed here, a slightly off-white fence there. Paul, operating through Brookwood Investments LLC, swooped in, promising her a clean slate. She signed immediately, relieved to be rid of Karen's tyranny. By the time he reached the third property, Paul had developed a pattern. Each deal was done through a different company, and no name ever repeated. Stonebridge Properties handled the third, Maplewood Estates the fourth, and Horizon Ventures took the fifth. The transactions were seamless, each seller thrilled to escape Karen's iron-fisted rule. The sixth house was the final piece of the puzzle. It belonged to a retired veteran, a man who had fought for his country but found himself bullied by a woman wielding nothing more than a clipboard and a superiority complex. Paul, using Legacy Living LLC, gave the man a fair offer and even helped cover his moving expenses. When the papers were signed, Paul leaned back in his chair, the weight of his plan finally settling into place. Each of these properties was now under Paul's control, yet no one, not even the HOA board, knew that one man was behind them all. Karen still thought she was untouchable, still believed she had complete authority over the neighborhood. She was wrong. Paul didn't just walk into the next HOA meeting, he owned it. He strolled in with an easy confidence, nodding politely to the familiar faces who had suffered under Karen's reign. He could see it in their eyes, the exhaustion, the quiet desperation. But tonight, everything would change. Karen sat at the head of the table, her signature smug expression plastered across her face. She shuffled through her stack of papers, the sound of rustling pages filling the tense room. When she finally looked up, her eyes locked onto Paul's. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice thick with condescension, "we need to address the ongoing issue of your non-compliant vehicle modifications." Paul tilted his head slightly. "Oh, you mean the Save the Bees bumper sticker?" Karen gave a tight-lipped smile. "You understand, of course, that all exterior modifications must be approved by the HOA." Paul folded his hands on the table, taking a measured breath before speaking. "Actually, Karen, as someone who now owns 30% of the neighborhood, I think it's time we revisit some of these rules." The room fell silent. The tension thickened like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. Karen's smile twitched, her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair a little tighter. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly unsure. Paul reached into his leather folder and slid a stack of documents across the table. According to HOA bylaws, any homeowner who controls more than 25% of the neighborhood has the right to call a vote on new leadership. Karen's face turned white. The papers in front of her detailed each of the 6 properties, each owned by a different company, all tied back to him. Her kingdom was crumbling right before her eyes, and for the first time, she had no clever retort. The other board members exchanged glances, some looking eager, others hesitant. Paul pressed forward. "This board has been operating under the assumption that homeowners here are powerless, but as of tonight, that changes." Karen sputtered. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "I can, and I did," Paul interrupted smoothly. "And I suggest you take a seat and listen." A murmur rippled through the room. Several homeowners, emboldened by Paul's confidence, sat up straighter. Karen's iron grip had relied on fear, but fear only worked when people believed they had no other choice. "A vote will be held," Paul continued. "We'll decide right here, right now, if this community wants real leadership, or if we'll continue to let unchecked power dictate our lives." The vote didn't go Paul's way, not yet. Karen had spent years stacking the board with her allies, and they weren't about to let their iron grip slip so easily. As the final vote was counted and the results announced, a slow, smug smile crept across Karen Cypher's face. She leaned back in her chair, adjusting her pearl necklace, and gave Paul a look that dripped with condescension. "Nice try, Paul," she said, voice thick with amusement, "but this neighborhood is mine. Always has been, always will be." A few of her lackeys chuckled, exchanging glances as if they had just witnessed a child lose a game of chess against a grandmaster. The room was filled with the sounds of forced applause from board members who knew exactly where their loyalties lay. But Paul? He didn't flinch. He didn't rage. He just smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Karen smirk falter for just a second, and that was all he needed. Because Paul wasn't here to win a vote. He was here to win the war. Paul knew Karen had been running the HOA like her own personal empire for years, but he needed undeniable proof. That's where his old friend Mason came in. A top-tier private investigator with a nose for financial misdeeds, Mason wasted no time digging into every transaction, every contract, every backroom deal that Karen had orchestrated. What he found? It was worse than Paul had expected. Thousands of dollars in HOA fees were unaccounted for, conveniently misplaced in vague administrative expenses. Karen had been funneling money into shady contracts with businesses secretly owned by her relatives. Homeowners who opposed her suddenly found themselves hit with mysterious maintenance fees or forced to repaint their homes, using only HOA-approved vendors who just so happened to be linked to Karen's closest associates. Paul sifted through the reports late into the night, each new discovery fueling the fire inside him. He wasn't just going to take down Karen. He was going to obliterate her reign over Brookwood Estates. Karen's power didn't come from the rules. It came from fear. Homeowners paid their fines, followed her ridiculous guidelines, and kept their heads down because they believed they had no choice. But what if they realized they weren't alone? What if they knew the truth? Paul launched an anonymous website, a digital safe haven where residents could finally speak freely. He posted the financial records Mason had uncovered, proof of Karen's blatant corruption. He encouraged others to come forward, and come forward they did. Homeowners shared their horror stories, ridiculous fines, threats of foreclosure, personal harassment. Pictures and videos poured in. The site went viral within the neighborhood. By the end of the week, even local news stations were sniffing around, asking questions. Karen was furious. Paul could see it in her every move, her clipped responses at meetings, the tight grip she kept on her ever-present red folder, the way her eyes darted around as if searching for traitors in her midst. She tried to control the narrative, sending out emails filled with vague, panicked explanations. But the damage was done. The homeowners were no longer afraid. They were angry. Paul had one last move to make, and it was his boldest yet. Karen ruled through financial control. She squeezed homeowners with fines and fees, weaponizing the HOA's power to keep them obedient. But what if Paul could cut off her supply? Through an investment firm, he did something Karen never saw coming. He bought out the mortgage company that held the majority of home loans in Brookwood Estates. Now, it wasn't Karen who owned the neighborhood. It was him. The moment she found out, Paul saw it happen. The moment realization dawned in her eyes. The sheer, unfiltered terror that crossed her face as she stormed into the next meeting, slamming a stack of papers onto the table. "This is illegal," she hissed, her voice shaking. You can't do this." Paul just leaned back in his chair, mirroring the very same smug expression she had given him after the vote. "Oh, but I can, Karen, and I did." She was cornered, and she knew it. Everything Paul had done, exposing her corruption, turning the homeowners against her, and now stripping away her financial leverage, was all leading to this. The once untouchable queen of Brookwood Estates was now a desperate, floundering wreck. And it all led back to one thing: the vandalism on his Tesla. Karen had thought she was untouchable. She had thought that by scratching his car, she was sending him a message. But in the end, all she had done was light the fuse that would burn her entire empire to the ground. This was a woman who had ruled Brookwood Estates with an iron fist, who had bullied and manipulated homeowners into submission for years. She wasn't used to losing. and she certainly wasn't used to being outplayed. Her eyes darted around the room looking for allies, someone, anyone, to back her up. But the same board members who had once stood by her side now avoided her gaze. The homeowners who had cowered under her tyranny now sat forward in their chairs, watching with barely concealed anticipation. No one was coming to her rescue. Paul gestured lazily toward the document she had thrown onto the table. "By all means, Karen, enlighten us. What exactly is illegal here?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. She was drowning, and for the first time in her life, there was no lifeline. Paul didn't wait for her to recover. Instead, he turned to his lawyer, who was already flipping through the documents with a bemused expression, and then to the police officer seated beside him. "Karen," he said, his voice steady, almost sympathetic, "we need to have a chat about financial fraud." The color drained from her face. "This is a joke," she whispered, but her voice had lost its edge. Her fingers trembled as she tried to gather the papers back into her arms, as if physically holding on to them would keep her world from collapsing. "Oh, it's no joke," Paul countered. "Because here's the thing. You didn't just break some HOA rules, Karen. You broke the law. Embezzlement, fraud, harassment. We have the evidence." Karen took a shaky step backward, but the walls of the boardroom seemed to close in on her. The whispers of the homeowners grew louder. The weight of her crimes, once hidden beneath years of bureaucratic loopholes and manipulative tactics, now crushed her like an avalanche. She turned on her heel, making a beeline for the door. Run, that was her instinct. Run, before the consequences caught up with her. But Paul had been waiting for this. The moment she stepped outside, two uniformed officers were waiting for her, their expressions unreadable, their presence unshakable. "Karen Cypher?" one of them asked, reaching for his handcuffs. She froze, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. "No," she croaked. "This isn't happening." "It is," the officer said simply. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and harassment." The neighborhood exploded into murmurs and gasps. Some cheered, others simply stared in stunned silence as Karen's wrists were pulled behind her back and the cold steel of the cuffs locked around them with an audible click. The once feared queen of Brookwood Estates had fallen. Paul stepped outside, the warm breeze ruffling his shirt as he watched her being led toward the patrol car. She fought, of course, yanking against their grip, shrieking that this was all a mistake, that she was being framed. But no one came to her defense. She was alone, just as she had left so many others when they needed help. Paul let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting past the scene to the very thing that had started this war, his Tesla. It still bore the deep, angry claw marks she had carved into it with her keys. A final, petty act of control before she had lost everything. But as Paul studied those scratches, he realized something. They weren't a mark of defeat. They were a badge of victory. Karen had thought she could destroy him. Instead, she had only signed her own downfall. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a new bumper sticker, peeling off the backing as he walked toward his car. With a smirk, he pressed it onto the rear bumper, right beside the old Save the Bees sticker that had triggered Karen's vendetta in the first place. It read, "Justice served." If you love this story, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tell us your worst HOA horror stories in the comments. Let's keep exposing these power-hungry tyrants one neighborhood at a time.